A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "A rich man had a steward who was reported to him for squandering his property. He summoned him and said, 'What is this I hear about you? Prepare a full account of your stewardship, because you can no longer be my steward.' The steward said to himself, 'What shall I do, now that my master is taking the position of steward away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the stewardship, they may welcome me into their homes.' He called the master's debtors one by one. To the first he said, 'How much do you owe my master?' He replied, 100 measures of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Here is your promissory note. Sit down and quickly write one for 50. Then to another the steward said, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 cores of wheat. The steward said to him, 'Here is your promissory note. Write one for 80. And the master commended that dishonest steward for acting prudently. For the children of this world are more prudent in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. I tell you, make friends for yourself with dishonest wealth, so that when it fails, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. The person who is trustworthy in very small matters is also trustworthy in great ones. And the person who is dishonest in very small matters is also dishonest in great ones. If therefore you are not trustworthy with dishonest wealth, who will trust you with true wealth? If you are not trustworthy with what belongs to another, who will give you what is yours? No servant can serve two masters. He will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon." The Gospel of the Lord. This is a very strange parable that we just heard. It's perhaps one of the most puzzling and difficult parables in all of the Gospels, because Jesus seems to be praising fraud and dishonesty. Maybe so, maybe not. As the story stands, the meaning seems to be unclear. Many commentators will say it helps to shed some light on this parable if we look at it in conjunction with the parable we heard last week. You remember which one that was? The prodigal son. This one is sometimes labeled the dishonest steward. Well, I think also its meaning comes clearer if we look at it in the light of next week's parable. That we've got basically in Luke's gospel a trilogy of parables. Prodigal son, dishonest steward. Next week we're going to talk about the rich man and poor Lazarus. We'll leave that for next week. But all three of these parables, I think, are related in ways that each one can help to shed some light on the other one. You may remember 2 weeks ago when speaking on the gospel about that other strange gospel where Jesus says you have to hate your family, you have to take up your cross and follow me, that, for one thing, it's clear that to hate does not mean hate in the sense that we usually use the term, but to prefer less, to prefer Him and God's way more than our human earthly relationships. But I said that 2 Sundays ago there were 2 takeaways, 2 particular things that we need to pay attention to that we can take away from that reading. The first one was that Jesus turns things upside down. Worldly standards, our perspectives, our goals, all of those things, Jesus turns upside down. Remember the old saying, you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans, because his plans for us usually are upside down from what we want. We have to get used to that. But secondly, the second takeaway a couple of weeks ago was you have to become the change that you want in others. The change that you want to bring about in others, whether it's another person or in our world, you've got to become that change. You can't just do it at a distance. You have to be part of that change yourself. So now, in the light of that, let's look at last week's parable and this week's and see some similarities. The first similarity is that they both end with ambiguity. There's one sort of ambiguity last week, because the elder son and the father are left outside the household. And what's going to happen as a result of the father pleading with the elder son to come in and accept the younger brother back as part of the family? He doesn't tell us. It's up to us to finish it. Why? Because it's a mirror for us. Which one of those 2 are we? Or maybe more properly, what parts in each of us corresponds more to the prodigal son, and which parts correspond to the seemingly unforgiving and rigid elder brother? So it asks that question, but it doesn't answer it. Similarly, this parable ends in ambiguity. We really can't tell what it means with any certainty. It seems to have a whole bunch of different possible interpretations or explanations. But let's look at a couple of more similarities between last week's parable, the prodigal son, and this week. One that I think is key is that they both have an occasion of crisis. The crisis last week was that the prodigal son had dissipated all of the wealth that the father had left him, that he had taken from the family. He was reduced to abject poverty and servitude. And this crisis for the steward this week is a little bit similar, because it seems that he was squandering his master's property and was not being a faithful steward. And he lost his job. And what's he going to do about it? The interesting thing is, in those crises, both talk to themselves. Did you notice last week the prodigal son out there feeding the pigs talks to himself? What shall I do? I know I will go to my father and I will plead. I have no longer a right to be called his son. I will plead just to be one of his hired hands. And here, the steward talks to himself. What shall I do? I'm not fit for anything except what I've been doing. I know. I will renegotiate the contract with the master's creditors. And they both end up receiving what they don't deserve. Clearly, the prodigal son did not deserve to be brought back into the family by any human standards anyway, the way we would want to look at things. Remember, Jesus turns things upside down. But this dishonest steward doesn't deserve to be commended by his master, and yet he does commend him. He says, you were prudent, you were wise. Now, in order to understand that a little better, it may be helpful to look at the situation that faced the people who were listening to Jesus in his own time. Because the rich man would have been a wealthy landowner, and in the times of Roman occupation, the wealthy were able to increase their wealth in much the same way that the wealthy today increase their wealth. And that is by taking it away from those who are less powerful, by buying up or taking over the land of the meager pieces of land that families owned, and taking control of them, and then making those families pay taxes, pay a rent for the land that had formerly been their own. And naturally, their method was always to keep them in debt. In other words, to demand more rent than at any one given harvest they were capable of paying. So they would always be increasing their debt with this landowner. That's how he maintained his power. Does that sound familiar? That still seems to be going on here and there, doesn't it? At any rate, what the steward was apparently responsible for was to collect those rents, those debts. How much do you little olive tree farmer, how much do you owe my master? Well, let's change that and reduce it. You wheat farmer, how much do you owe my master? Well, let's reduce that. Many commentators will say he was actually just reducing his own commission. He wasn't cheating the landowner out of what was truly owed to him, but rather he was reducing it to a fair amount. And the landowner said, that was a smart thing to do, because now they will receive you into their homes because you made it easier for them. One of the lessons that Jesus seems to be drawing from this is what he told us in the moral. The moral of the story is that use the resources that you have, even if they may be dishonest, for the goals, the purposes of the kingdom. What that means is use the resources you have for compassion, because that is the goal of the kingdom of God. Compassion. Compassion for those who are in need. If you have more than enough, that doesn't really belong to you. That belongs to those who are in need. All of the fathers of the church, the great writers of the church, continued to emphasize that. That wealth that you have, that we have, that is beyond our need, doesn't really belong to us. It belongs to those who are in need. So that the goal of the kingdom of God will be a kingdom of compassion rather than simply an association of self-interest. So the moral that Jesus gives is that if God is truly our master rather than money, we have to take a look at what resources we have and ask ourselves, are we using our own resources for our own self-enrichment, self-protection, or are we using our resources for the kingdom of God, which is manifested in compassion and mercy?